Welcome to the Education Hotline podcast, the long-form podcast that brings you research-informed approaches to promote teaching and learning in your classroom. I am your host, Rachel Simister. As always, it's my goal to provide you with a critical analysis of a relevant educational issue with a view to persuading you to try something new in your primary classroom. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into aspects of thinking and philosophy for children and how this can promote effective teaching and learning. Firstly, we'll take a look at the evidence that philosophy for children, as an approach, has a positive impact on teaching and learning outcomes, and then we'll take a closer look into one particular aspect, dialogic talk, and how and why you should consider building this into your own practice. I know that you, my valued podcast listeners, are far too discerning to just take what I say at face value, so I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Bella Jewson. It's Bella's role today to ask me some challenging questions to ensure that my views stand up to scrutiny. I'll also be answering some listener questions towards the end of the show, so get ready to challenge me via the chat box. You can find all of today's references in the show notes. Let's start with a bit of background on philosophy for children, in case this is new to you. Philosophy for children was developed in America in the late 1960s, early 1970s by Matthew Lipman, and the program aimed to get children thinking for themselves and developing their ability to reason effectively and to understand more about themselves and the world. Lipman's approach was to engage children in thoughtful dialogue through the sharing of literature. Research from 2015 showed that P4C had positive impacts on Key Stage 2 attainment, with pupils showing an additional 2 months' progress in reading and maths. Even more impressive was that the biggest positive impact was seen on pupils in receipt of free school meals. If I can interject here, Rachel, wasn't this research criticised for its lack of statistical significance testing? I seem to remember an article in Schools Week which outlined that as statistical significance tests hadn't been performed, it wasn't possible to be confident that the improvements had been caused by P4C and that they could have just been by chance. How would you respond to that? Ah yes, I do remember those criticisms. They did affect the credibility of the study. I'd say we need to dig deeper into the evidence base to find out if we can have confidence in the claims that P4C promotes effective teaching and learning. In fact, wasn't there a later EEF report that showed that in an even larger trial, there was no evidence that P4C had a positive impact on academic outcomes? So the results from that report do sound pretty damning, don't they? But do you realise that of the 75 schools in that study, 35 schools didn't fully implement P4C, and 6 didn't implement it at all? So let's have a look at the broader evidence base and see if I can convince you that P4C does improve outcomes. I know that many of the early studies on P4C were criticised for a lack of academic rigour, but since then, a number of systematic meta-analyses have been conducted and they used a screening process to weed out studies which didn't stand up to scrutiny. These meta-analyses generally agreed that P4C does have a positive effect on cognitive learning outcomes and a significant positive effect on reasoning skills. Okay, you've convinced me about the outcomes, but what about making this work in the real world? If I now accept what you say about the positive impacts it can have, which I do, how do I make that happen in my classroom? Well, there are several aspects to philosophy for children, including metacognition, questioning, philosophical themes, and community of inquiry. Today, we'll discuss a specific pedagogical approach that's used in P4C, dialogic talk. Oh, I've heard of that, but I don't really understand what it is. Dialogic talk was formed, in its present state, by Robin Alexander with his seminal work Towards Dialogic Teaching, Rethinking Classroom Talk. Dialogic talk and P4C both emerged from the social constructivist paradigm in which the teacher's subject knowledge and pedagogical skills in scaffolding learning and questioning promote learning in a social context. The Education Endowment Foundation, or EEF, claims that the aim of dialogic teaching is to improve pupil engagement and attainment through making the quality of classroom talk more meaningful, whereas the SAPER organisation puts an emphasis on exploring big ideas that appear in both education and life, stating that philosophical dialogue allows learners to increase their effectiveness in speaking, listening, and learning to live together. The EEF found consistent positive effects of dialogic talk in English, science, and maths for all children in Year 5, equivalent to about 2 months additional progress. So, is dialogic talk part of philosophy for children, or is philosophy for children part of dialogic talk? That's a really interesting question, Bella, and I think we're getting into our own little philosophical discussion at this point. I find the relationship between P4C and dialogic talk interesting because you can have dialogic talk in a classroom with or without P4C, but you can't have P4C without dialogic talk because you just wouldn't achieve the necessary depth of dialogue required for P4C. P4C just wouldn't work using a monologic approach or the other types of classroom talk that Alexander outlines, for example, rote, recitation, and instruction. Isn't dialogic talk just the same as Q&A, question and answering? So dialogic talk does use questions and answers, but in a way that promotes deeper consideration and thinking. You might have used the Initiation Response Feedback Exchange, also known as the IRF exchange. The structure of this exchange is that the teacher will initiate a discussion or a question, the student will respond, and the teacher will feed back. One simple way you could try out dialogic talk in your classroom is to supplement a typical IRF loop with the IRPR loop. In this loop, the feedback typically provided after a pupil's response is replaced by a prompt which represents a supplementary query from the teacher to enable the pupil to develop their initial response into something more complete, specific, reasoned, or evidenced. In fact, I would go even further and adapt Sadova's model so the process was iterative and the prompt response elements were repeated whilst there was value to be gained from the dialogue. So is dialogic talk something that only happens between teachers and pupils? No, it's not. Dialogic talk between pupils is an effective tool for learning. They are given the opportunity to further develop their understanding and gain the ability to solve problems and make sense of experiences through peer discussion. You can do this by posing questions to pupils and allowing the children to discuss and inquire into answers. By encouraging dialogic talk between pupils, you are challenging typical classroom structures which allow for developing autonomy and communicative competence. So what about children who don't feel they can engage in these open dialogues? You could be discussing some challenging topics and some children may be too worried to talk in the sessions for the fear of saying something they feel is wrong or silly. So this is about creating a community of inquiry and should be done to nurture cooperation, not competition. There are also no right or wrong answers with philosophical questions, and there should be an expectation set out that uncertainty is welcome and you will not be focusing on correct answers. Dialogue is a skill that has to be learnt, and it will take practice for children to create meaningful dialogue, and they should not be expected to get it right straight away. Evidence also suggests that using dialogic approaches in teaching and having children engage in dialogic discussions helps challenge the idea that standardized tests are the only way to measure a child's capability. Allowing dialogic exchanges in the classroom can lead to improved outcomes for children that typically, from standardized test results, would be labelled low achievers. And due to the dialogue that happens in these sessions, teachers are able to see pupils in a different, more positive light. Okay, so how do I know if I'm using dialogic talk? What are its characteristics? Dialogic talk is cumulative, supportive, reciprocal, collective, and purposeful. Classroom questions are designed to stimulate thoughtful answers which lead to further questions. The questions and answers are the building blocks of dialogue rather than a single start and end point as with a typical IRF exchange. Individual exchanges are linked together into a cohesive exploration. Of the 8 types of teaching talk identified by Alexander, only 4 are considered to be dialogic in form. These are discussion, deliberation, argumentation, and dialogue. I'll just give you an overview of these to make sure you understand the differences. So discussion refers to an open exchange of ideas aiming to share information and juxtapose opinions. Deliberation relates to weighing the merits of ideas, opinions, and evidence. Argumentation refers to reasoning and giving evidence, and dialogue relates to structured questioning and elaborated responses intended to develop new understanding in pupils. He doesn't consider the other 4 types of talk, rote, recitation, instruction, and exposition, to be dialogic. As a teacher wishing to develop a dialogic classroom, you would try to balance, possibly minimise, the use of rote, recitation, instruction, and exposition, and replace them with discussion, deliberation, argumentation, and dialogue. It does take practice to develop these skills. The 2017 EEF study found that teachers believed it would take in excess of 2 terms to fully embed a dialogic approach. So this is definitely a long game and an investment. One study found that when teachers were not providing appropriate questions to initiate the philosophical inquiry, this led to children only having linear exchanges that were not argumentative as they were discussing their own ideas individually, and so not creating a community of inquiry. Another study from 2013 supports this and agrees that talk is essential for learning and development. However, not all talk is educational. Research in 2014 found that even when teachers have adequate knowledge and want to engage in the activity, they can find it really challenging to transition from their traditional teacher role to this facilitator of meaningful dialogue. So how do I manage behaviour during this type of activity? What if my pupils don't see this as a proper lesson because it might seem different to what they're used to? So research does suggest that there are sometimes challenges with students who cannot sit still during these dialogic sessions and will be disruptive or purposefully provocative. However, we know that this is a potential issue in any lesson. One issue that does link directly to the use of dialogic talk with children is that some children may find it hard to participate in these sessions compared to standard lessons. Setting ground rules can help guide children to the correct and appropriate behaviour by establishing a caring and collaborative ethos and community. Having these ground rules paired with listening to children's questions and interests at the centre of the educational process can actually have a positive impact on learner autonomy and engagement. One way in which we can ensure these children aren't missing out and are included in the dialogic inquiries is to scaffold and model different skills children may use, for example, clarification, elaboration and technique. We also must be aware of not being exclusionary within our philosophical inquiries. Not all children have the same experiences. If a philosophical inquiry is to do with something a child has no lived experience of, they may feel they are unable to articulate meaningful questions and responses. Ensuring context is provided and that children are aware of what they are being asked to do, all children should be able to participate in a dialogue of philosophical inquiry. I really like the rationale you're sharing, but I'm still concerned about making it happen in the classroom. How do I bring in this approach on top of everything else I already have to do? Dialogic talk isn't something to be bolted on to existing practice. You should try to see it as an alternative approach to teaching and learning which replaces some other, less effective practices. It may not even mean that there is more talk in the classroom, it's about improving the quality of the talk that takes place. In my view, dialogic talk is the best chance you have as a teacher of getting inside your pupils' minds and understanding their thought processes. Consider a situation in which you ask a pupil to cancel down or simplify the fraction 16/64. In a non-dialogic classroom, the pupil answers 1/4, and you tell the pupil they are correct, and you move on. Now consider if you asked the pupil why they had come up with an answer of 1/4, and they told you that they had crossed out the 6 in the numerator and the 6 in the denominator, as they cancelled each other out, leaving a 1 in the numerator and a 4 in the denominator. This extended dialogue now tells you that the pupil is employing an erroneous method and does not have conceptual understanding of the nature of cancelling or simplifying fractions. So you're saying that you don't have to wait for your leadership team to adopt a whole school approach to this, and you can simply take small steps as a classroom teacher to improve teaching and learning through dialogic talk in any lesson? Exactly. Whilst a whole school approach is likely to have a greater impact overall, you, as an individual practitioner, can implement these changes in your own teaching in an incremental way until they become a natural part of your day-to-day practice. You never know, the impact in your own pupils might be so great that your leadership team decides to adopt these approaches on a whole school basis. Okay, it's time to tackle some of the listener questions that have been coming in through the chat box. Bella, if you'd be so kind as to read out the questions and I'll do my best to answer them. Of course. Question 1 is from Savannah, who is a Key Stage 2 classroom teacher just like me. Savannah has a question about participation. She asks, how would you address the issue of unequal participation among pupils in dialogic talk? Some of her pupils tend to dominate discussions, whereas others are reluctant to speak at all. How can she make sure that her pupils are not getting penalised in terms of their learning opportunities? Thanks for that, Savannah. Good question. Firstly, I would recommend that you plan in advance how you will manage this, rather than trying to manage it as it happens. You can plan in strategies like structured turn-taking or pair or small group discussions prior to a whole class discussion. Let us know how that works for you, Savannah. Do we have any other listener questions, Bella? Yes, here's a question from Liam, who is a Year 2 teacher. He asks, how can he ensure that pupils who are learning English as an additional language do not face barriers to participation during dialogic talk? Great question, Liam. This is such an important aspect to consider in your teaching. I have a few suggestions you can try. If the dialogic talk includes new or unusual vocabulary, you could pre-teach that vocabulary before the session. You can supplement this with visual cues and by encouraging pupils to pay attention to supplementary non-verbal communication, such as gestures and facial expressions. You could also plan in wait time, which will actually benefit all pupils in allowing additional time to develop their thoughts. I think we've only got time for one more question now. Here's a question from Liv, who works in a very small primary school in North Yorkshire. She says, working in a small village school, our funds are limited. How can I introduce dialogic talk or philosophy for children as a whole when there are no additional funds for resources or training? Thanks, Liv. One of the best things about dialogic talk in my view is that the key resources needed are you and your pupils. Because Dialogic Talk focuses on the quality of classroom conversation, you don't need to spend money on particular resources or technology to engage with it. In terms of training, there are several freely available resources you can use to develop your own skills, such as those provided free of charge by Will Odd on his website. I'll include the link in the show notes for you, Liv. And I would strongly recommend that, if you can, work together with some like-minded colleagues that will give you vital peer support in developing and reflecting on your practice. Let me know how you get on. I'd love to hear how you do. Unfortunately, we are nearly out of time, so I'd like to finish today's podcast with a countdown of my top 5 reasons why Dialogic Talk should be integrated into every primary classroom. Number 5. Dialogic Talk engages pupils in an active way rather than merely as a respondent. This active engagement is a critical part of the learning process from a constructivist perspective. Number 4. Dialogic Talk develops pupils' language skills, which is a prerequisite for effective learning. Number 3. Dialogic Talk provides opportunities for pupils to collaborate with each other and with the other adults in the classroom in a meaningful way. This social interaction enables pupils' learning to be scaffolded. Number 2. Dialogic Talk promotes an inclusive learning environment in which diverse perspectives and views are valued and respected. This inclusivity is essential if pupils are to be seen and treated as unique individuals. And topping the charts, my number 1 for how Dialogic Talk promotes effective teaching and learning is, drumroll please, Dialogic Talk enables the teacher to build a supporting learning community in the classroom where pupils are comfortable and confident in expressing their ideas. This community of inquiry fosters a positive classroom culture in which pupils are willing to step outside of their comfort zone and take risks which facilitate and deepen their learning. But that's all we have time for today. I hope that I've convinced you to try out some of these approaches we've discussed, or at least to follow up on some of the research that you'll find in the show notes. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave me a review, and I hope you'll join me next time on the Education Hotline.